Your question?
Oh, my question. Okay. I guess we can move on from Brown's Redacted because obviously we don't want to talk about just race, right? I mean, we don't want to pigeonhole you guys. So I think for Kristian, something I was really interested while reading your bio is your interest in masculinity and male allyship. Okay, so I think something really worrying for me is the rise of figures like Andrew Tate. So, I mean, how can we fight toxic masculinity, and perhaps could you share about the attitudes towards masculinity perhaps in the brown community? Like, is it different from how it is in the Chinese community, for example?
You must be high valued men.
Andrew Tate, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, I think it is, I know my bio talks about like community discussions and things like that, and obviously that's important, right? This idea of education, but I think I'm personally not necessarily convinced about like sort of like the like quote unquote politics of education. I remember reading this one like blog post that my friend shared about, which was not directly related to Singapore, but they shared it in reference to when Priti and Subhash had made the video, and then how then I think I guess what they were trying to say from the video, and this person shared this article which was I think in reference to BLM specifically, but this idea of like the limits to like the politics of education, and what it means is that like we say a lot that we must educate ourselves, like education is the way forward, which is not false, but it's also just like there is like sort of like inherent or built into that is this idea of it being for the future, right? If we're educating like future generations, or if we're educating ourselves, it's not necessarily like nothing is really being solved right now. So I wouldn't necessarily just say like, we should educate men. Of course we should, but like that's not the thing that I would say we should do. That's just sort of like the default thing. I would say like, again, this is going back to like solutions and what the individual can do in Singapore, and I think we should think a lot about the kinds of institutions that uphold specific kinds of masculinities, right? I guess I am thinking about national service, for example, and even though I have like specific views about national service, I think it is worth thinking about how that institution upholds certain kinds of masculinity, for example, and then as an individual, what can you do to actively challenge the current definition of national service, for example? I mean, obviously there are different institutions, but so I would say as a society, it's worth us re-examining also these kinds of places where like very specific kind of like masculinity is constructed and socialized, because that has such deep implications to then what you think of as success, what you think of as like a successful man, what you think of as, of like successful leadership, that really like bleeds into like the rest of your life. So I guess that's what I would say. I think parents really do need to do a lot more work. I guess especially like fathers, in terms of what does it mean to be a loving or tender father, is something that I think people should ask. I mean, I still hear a lot of anecdotes from like the office and things like that, where like of like young dads being like, my son can't wear pink, and it's really like, y'all are like millennials, you're not boomers. Like, what's happening? Why you still have this view? So I think like people really just need to like step up and really like be good like parental figures, and really, really like do that work of trying to like shed that. You want to talk about brown masculinity? I feel like you explore it in like Brown Mysara.
It's very interesting, because I feel like as brown woman, you're caught in the middle. On one hand, you're like fighting patriarchy in your own community, right? Doesn't help Andrew Tate is apparently now Muslim, oh God. Seriously, like, and apparently, he starts quoting the Quran and like, okay, sure bro, like, okay. And I think patriarchy I can only talk about the Malay community, right? Like, patriarchy in the Malay Muslim community has been something that Malay women have been fighting for like the longest of time. And then you face Chinese women who apparently come to you and you're like, yeah, I met one Malay guy, and they start sprouting like things that are pretty racist, and then you have to defend the men in your community, right? Or like a Chinese woman who date brown women, and they're like, yeah, like I don't want to date any more Chinese men. Like I think sometimes you have to acknowledge how brown women treat Chinese women is very different from how they treat us brown women also. So there's many layers to it. Ultimately, what I would say when you talk about like masculinity in the brown community is listen to the brown woman. Listen to the brown woman. We know best. We know best, right? Because we deal with them from birth, right? And I'm the only daughter of like in my parents, like in the family, and there's a lot of things that I would have to fight. But of course I think I'm pretty lucky because my parents are pretty much, you can do whatever you want, you can travel, we're not gonna like bother you. But of course, there are things that I would like argue with them like on a daily basis, and I have two brothers, so I feel like when we talk about like brown masculinity, understand that it's not like one thing, right? Like people always attribute it to culture or religion, but it's not always that straightforward, because how we are like is also determined by, I think what Chris mentioned earlier was, like structures, right? A lot of brown men are still, there's a lot of barriers, for brown men, when they face, because I know that in the eyes of the Chinese majority, I'm that educated, successful Malay woman, right? Even if they don't agree with what I say, because by default they see me as successful, like okay, I'm not gonna like really fight her, or they think it's okay, or they think that because she's successful, she is gonna trash the people in her community, which is not true, right? I've gotten in so many like Grab rides where the Chinese drivers are like, yeah, a lot of Malay men take drugs, a lot of Malay men this, a lot of Malay men that. It's not something that it's very blatantly racism, and as a woman I don't appreciate that as well as a brown woman, because you're making me do the effort or put a label of explaining to you why that is racist, and I think that when brown women say like just don't, there's certain fights or battles in our community that we like to like keep it to our community because it's so complex, and we don't expect people from the majority to like fight it, but also acknowledge that before you make such sentiments about the men in the community, understand that the men, when you put racial structures, like I think some researchers have said where, when there's barriers to them progressing, to put it like, for lack of better words, the victims or the people who feel it the most are the women in the community. They're not gonna like, they don't have the space to kind of like lash out, right? To the majority, they can't do that. So it's the women who get the brunt of it. So, sometimes I know people in the community talk about it, people outside the community, talk about it, but ultimately how they talk about it hurt us as well, So I think when we address like brown masculinity, I think I'm going around, but like going around in circles, but ultimately just listen to us, and we'll tell you what you should be concerned about, or what you should just leave it to us, because you don't want to be the reason why Malay women or Indian women have to do the effort of like defending the men in our community because what you say hurt us.
I think something that I add also is that like what Mysara said, I don't think this is specific to like the non-Chinese communities, but like I guess in minority communities especially, right, sort of like the attempt to sort of prove your worth or to sort of transcend your brownness comes at the expense of like brown women, right? Like it is the tactic becomes like incredibly like misogynistic, and I think this is something that our other co-editor actually explores in his script in Brown Boys Don't Tell Jokes, where there are these brown guys who are trying to fit into this group of in their orientation group with these other Chinese guys, and they're all joking, right, and they're making racist jokes, about a brown woman, and that definitely I think happens. I've definitely experienced it, and like I mean, it definitely keeps happening, right? The idea that in order to sort of try and prove your worth, especially in like a majority community, you put like others down, and oftentimes that comes out in like misogynistic ways, in putting down like brown women. I mean, so like in the lead up to Brown is Haram, like I did these discussions on like brown masculinity, right? The sort of holding on to like privilege of being a man, but then also like in some instances like your brownness then coming into play. Yeah, it was so interesting like hearing people admit these things, right? That they themselves obviously have been, you know, at times in their lives been like misogynistic, you know, have been homophobic, right? But that also comes from a very like specific place of wanting to feel like they're one of the bros, or like one of the like they fit in with like the Chinese bros, right? Like of course it is inexcusable, but like it also comes from a very certain place, very certain like form of like self-loathing, very certain form of like desire to be accepted also.
Yeah. And ultimately, that's a human thing, not like something that's specific to a race, right? Which is something that I also picked up in, I think, one of the essays about how you should like pathologize certain social issues, you know, like for example, you know, the diabetes, right? I think that's so much more useful to think in terms of, you know, like for example, class or access to healthcare, as opposed to, you know, just using the CMIO model and conveniently labeling things. And I think that also applies to what we have mentioned when it comes to brown masculinity, because it's not something specific to the brown community. It's just the very fact that they so happen to be the minority in this country, and so then that extra layer makes it harder for them.
I mean, I also think like this idea of brown masculinity also, you know, it falls into how we see brown people, right? We see the, you know, whether it's you see that Chinese woman moving away from her MRT seat when an Indian man sit like next to her and things like that, because you already have that perception of the you know violent brown man, or you know, that you should be afraid of because that's what your parents told you when you were growing up, right? I mean, I think last year there was this whole saga that went viral. This designer, she went on like I think it was like a panel, and she was saying that she designs cheongsams because she thinks Chinese women are more progressive than Malay and Indian women. And the example that she gave was, you know, like Chinese women were the first to want to shake hands with like white men. So to me, or men in general, like to me that was quite hilarious, because ultimately you can, you know, you are still framing your idea of success through the lens of men. Isn't that patriarchy, right? And also this idea that, you know, of course there's, you know, internally there's this whole discussion that we have within like the Malay Muslim community, but you know, understanding that Malay and Indian women, we have our own agency as well is important, because I think, you know, when you talk a lot about brown masculinity, you immediately assume that every brown man out there is patriarchal, right? And then every Chinese man out there is progressive. I beg to disagree. In fact, I strongly disagree, right? You know, I think that harms women in general, right? This idea that only brown men are patriarchal, you know, only Chinese men are progressive, because I've gotten a lot of sexist and sexualized comments from Chinese men as well. And I think, you know, once you understand that, yes, the women in the community are fighting this idea of like patriarchy in their own community, you know, but doesn't mean that they don't have their own agency, then I think we can talk about like progress, right? Because you see a woman covered up, you immediately assume that she's oppressed by her religion or her community. At the end of the day, like, you're still not letting women decide how they want to dress.
Just speaking on behalf of
you're speaking on behalf of them. You know, like, I'm gonna like defend my right to not like cover my hair, but I'm also gonna defend a woman trying to cover her hair. You know, you telling me like, wow, this is so bad, like they cover the hair. I'm like, no, like, just stop talking, right? That's not it, right? That's not it. So I think that's also very important. Like, how do we see the men and women in the minority communities, right? The brown woman that needs saving is not like a sentiment that I want to hear as well. Yeah,
I think what you say about, you know, sometimes being made by majority groups to sort of like, or sometimes being pit against, members of your own race or your own community, where you're told, oh, you're not like one of them, right? Or don't you agree with me?
Yeah.
They're like that, but you are not like that. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Also, like, even like when you see a brown woman being very outspoken, people are like, wow, where do you get that from? I'm like, it's like, if you see societies around the region, we have very matriarchal societies.
Yeah.
My granddad comes from like West Sumatra. It's a matriarchal society.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say actually. I feel like Malay societies tend to be quite matriarchal and they're quite respectful.
Yeah, I mean there is like patriarchy, definitely. There's patriarchy everywhere. But I think to only attribute it to us is very problematic. It doesn't help anything, doesn't help women actually. To just attribute it to race. It's a very lazy way actually of talking about patriarchy in the country.
So, Mysara, you're currently doing Malay Studies Masters, right? Maybe you can share a bit with us about what interests you or fascinates you about Malay Studies. Like, I've actually got a classmate who's doing MLL for A-levels, Malay Language and Literature,
Right.
And she's doing a research project this year on, I'm not really sure what her topic is, but every week she goes to NUS. And she has access to all the Malay Malay Studies department's resources. And every week she's like, I'm learning so much about like my community, which is a community that she's very involved in. So, but I think it's not really something that a lot of people know much about otherwise. Maybe.
What attracted me was I applied for this program when I was still working as like a producer, right? With Channel News Asia, and I realized that the media, especially whether it's talking about Malay media or English media, when we talk about community issues, it's very surface level. It's like, oh, this is happening. Like I think there was an article like, oh, 48% of men, Malay men are in prison for like drugs, but it doesn't really address the issue, right? And unless you're really deep in the circle, you won't really understand, which leads to like people in the community internalizing, very racist sentiments about your own self. I found out about the Malay Studies department. I was interested through friends who also studied there. I wanted to kind of break away from this narrative, but also find a department that really understands it. I don't think frankly, I don't feel like there's any perfect department to study. There's always I think rooms that can be improved in every department. But I felt like Malay Studies was a very good start to understanding it, right? It gives you access. A lot of people think you study the Malay language, but it's not. It's a multidisciplinary faculty. So it's like history, politics, culture, language, literature, art, and it gives you, I think, the basic understanding of the Malay community here, but also the bigger region. So that includes Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Philippines as well, right? And I think it definitely gave me a lot of insight and eye-opening knowledge to thinkers around the region, because a lot of these are often not I think seeked out, especially by Singaporean students, right? When you talk about social sciences, you think about the same white men, right? All white men, and that's it, right? But what about thinkers from the region, right? We want to understand about this, where this narrative of lazy Malays come from. Syed Hussein Alatas, right? It's in the myth of the lazy native. You have scholars like Lili Zubaida Rahim, who is a niece of Yusuf Ishak, who wrote I feel like it's a Holy Bible of Malay Studies, which is the Singapore Dilemma. She really goes into it, right? So there's all this knowledge out there that basically explains what we are trying to do, but because it's not huge, it's not a big department like sociology or political science or IR that everyone wants to take, it's often forgotten, right? You assume that it's not really important, but I mean, if you're gonna be living in Singapore, if you're Singaporean, I think understanding that is very important, right?
I think that's really important because it's so ironic that we know more about European history than the history of our own region.
Yes,
I really dislike that.
Yes, right. I think it's also a way to break away from I think how we behave in Southeast Asia, I believe in Singaporeans getting bullied by people in Southeast Asia, to be honest. Like sometimes we deserve that slander.
Call out.
Right? You
for
you
sure.
talk about Indonesia, people think it's just Bali, right? Or Jakarta or whatever, and that's it. When it's a bigger region, Indonesia and Malaysia is not homogeneous. Even when we talk about the Malays in Malaysia, it's not homogeneous. I think personally for me, I think when I write my pieces, like, I do see how people talk about, because it's Singapore is like, I guess like the opposite, right? Like, we are the minorities, but I know when I'm in Malaysia or Indonesia, I'm like, okay, I don't really have to think about race, right? But also how they talk about it, it's okay, there are things that I don't want to repeat in my community and things like that. So it breaks away from this very like privileged Singaporean like mindset.
Coming from a more literary perspective, right? Is there something more like, is there a defining trait about Malay literature as compared to Western literature? Because I think my impression is that, at least for modern Western literature, they're quite obsessed with the idea of individuality. Like, this work is attributed to this individual. Whereas I feel like in Malay literature, there's this emphasis on like community aspect, and like some works are literally just anonymous works. I think like recently, I think one of our poetry readers read this anonymous proverb that she says quite popular in the community, like something about how yang merah itu saga and then yang indah itu bahasa, right? And then like these, you don't get these anonymous like poems in like in Western culture. So is that something defining for Malay literature?
I do agree in some sense. I'm not like a Malay literature expert. I have to make that like clear. I haven't sat in for like Dr. Azhar's class enough to talk about it. But I think Malay literature for me, at least, the way I see it has always been the way it's written, right? When I talk about Malay literature, I'm talking about the bigger region as well, right? It has always had its way of talking about community or critiquing about community. And these are coming from like, what we would call Islamic scholars as well. And then sometimes they write, you'd be like, wow, like you wouldn't expect that coming from a male Islamic scholar. And these are men who write about, or critiquing, how women are treated in society. Like you don't see that much anymore, but like at that point of time back then, like you had a lot of that literature. There is a piece of literature that I think changed my life forever. Like it's a piece from this Indonesian writer who critiques. So he's from like the Minangkabau society, where community where, like along my standard family is from, and there's a lot of writers there, and there's even a city there that's like known as like the writer's city. Like a lot of the big writers are from there, and they are, even though people think of them and they are quite conservative Islamic society, there are a lot of like literature that critiques how people view religion, and the way they write it is to me incredible, because you don't really see that kind of writing anymore. It's very sharp, where like there is that particular literature, Robohnya surau kami, which translates to the demolish of our suraus, or like small place like prayer spaces. So it's a critique about how sometimes this very fatalistic idea of religion in the society. We leave it everything to God. I don't have to work. I don't have to do anything. I just pray to God. But essentially, he writes about how that's not what religion is, right? And I think that I feel like is defining of Malay literature in that sense, right? It's finding that like very unique voice to kind of critique it. It doesn't have to be straightforward. Sometimes it's sharp, and it's meant to be sharp. So I think that is what I love about like Malay literature. You can't. The thing about translating it gets lost. The essence of it is lost.
Yeah, I think we've overshot our allotted 1 hour by quite a bit. But maybe just to end things off, I'll ask both of you, what comes next? I know both of you have said you don't want to be defined as co-editor of Brown is Redacted. So besides having co-editor of Brown is Redacted, what next to your name? What else is there? What are you working on right now? What comes next?
I just have to finish my thesis. 2 months, man. It's been a long time, honestly, I'm looking forward to like a good break. I did my first exhibition in Jakarta this year, and that was really, really interesting. And I'm hoping to kind of like expand my works out of Singapore, personally. But also I think, essentially break away from like race-related
Yeah.
work, I would love to ultimately do more works revolving around like Malay women and this idea of femininity in the community as well. And yeah, I haven't really thought about like how I'm gonna go into that, but that is definitely a topic that I'm interested in like looking at, also I think looking at the region really interests me as well. Especially with my frequent trips around the region, I'm like, it's very interesting how people in the region see the Malay community. Sometimes they forget that we exist, or like they don't really know much about us, right? So it's I would like to kind of bring this all these works to the region.
Yeah, I think apart from Brown's Redacted, so we're also going to go down to obviously Jakarta to do a talk actually in Jakarta about Brown's Redacted. But beyond that, I think I am interested in. I mean, obviously, as it says in my bio, I guess I identify as an activist and do a lot of things, I guess, in Singapore. So I am interested also in like writing about activism. And so that's definitely something that I guess I'm thinking about. Obviously with Ethos Books, there is something coming up next year, I guess, that I'm writing for on behalf of SG Climate Rally. So I think that's interesting. I also have a few things coming up with other publications like Jom that will be coming out soon. And then a shameless plug that SG Climate Rally will be having another physical rally this year. So I think a lot of my time, at least in the second half of the year, will be preoccupied with that. Another thing to note is that our other contributor, Mile Yente, has his book coming out with Ethos in June called Cat Skull. It's like a neo-noir crime thriller set in Singapore.
Sounds really cool.
Oh, you can edit this part out also. I've only read one neo-noir crime thriller set in Singapore and it sucked.
Okay.
I won't edit this.
The bar is low.
That's true.
Can only go up from here.
So that sounds interesting. I'll check it out. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much to Kristian and Mysara from Brown is Redacted for coming down to SLS today and agreeing to take part in this interview. I've really enjoyed hearing what you had to say, and I really enjoyed reading your book as well. I think it speaks to the experiences of many, many, many people in Singapore.
Not just from the brown community.
Not just from the brown community, I think it speaks to experiences of, feeling alienated or othered in all sorts of ways. Thank you. Sorry.
Do you want to
how do you
plug your stuff?
Remember to follow us on Instagram at SplooshSG and follow our podcast for more.
Okay. Golden Mile open call, we pay, so you can submit in Thai or English. What else? Next show, 27th of May at Crane. Yep, I don't know.
Right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.